Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Citizens Club of Springfield. I'm Joyce Narduli, president of this fine organization of volunteers. You may have noticed we're not in the Peggy Ryder Theater today, and that's not because we didn't think we'd have a big crowd. It's because they have space set up there for a performance this evening, and they've got props and strings and wires all over the place. So we're going to be here today. As always, we are going to thank our sponsors and our partners, which are WMAY, WUIS, and the Audio Visual Department of the Mayor's Office. I'd like to give a special shout out this morning to Tony Thompson, our videographer right here, and his wife for helping us spread the word about today's program. Thank you, Tony. I also want to thank Kendra at Custom Cup, and also today's coffee sponsor, Mary Kathy Schwartz and John Schaefer. Let's thank them, please. Our coffee sponsorships are available for $100, but it occurs to me if you pair up with a friend, it's only $50. So think about that. Just as a reminder, our meetings are always free and open to the public. So we'd like you to share the word about that. But we also hope you'll consider joining our mission and become a member. And that said, the cost is going to rise in July because our costs are going up. So we're currently $30 a year, but starting July 1st, it'll be $40. And that's really a good deal for all the programming you're getting here every month, I think. So if you are interested in joining, you can see Beverly Bunch. I don't see you right now, Beverly, but in the back of the room somewhere. And she'll be happy to take your money. And now on to our program. American Lynching, from Chicago to New Orleans, with our speaker today, Tim Good. And Tim's a graduate of Valparaiso with a BA in American History and a Master's in History from the University of Durham, England. He also earned a diploma from the U.S. Naval War College. He is the author of 6 books. And I could say so much more about you, Tim, but we'd then not have time for the program. So with that, I'd like to invite Tim up to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Joyce. It's honored that she asked me to speak, and especially on this topic. And I especially want to thank her for all the work she does putting this together, and thank all of you for spending the time to come to this. I have found that this is one of the best organizations in Springfield for connections and also for learning more about the community. What a gift this is to Springfield. I'm very thankful that we have it. When Joyce asked me to talk on this topic, I had given a talk similar to this to the Abraham Lincoln Association last month. And I've got to admit, when I was preparing for that talk and also preparing for this one, well, let me put it to you this way. When there's a group down in Memphis that I've worked with, it's called the Lynching Sites Project. And they, about 6-7 years ago, they dedicated themselves to research and put a marker up for every single lynching in the county that Memphis is in, Shelby County. And I've been able to help them get financing for some of this, and I've made it a point to always be there for the dedication of one of these lynching markers. Now, I missed one, and so the next time I had time, I went down to Memphis, and 2 of them drove me out to the marker location. All 3 of us got out of the car. I started walking towards the marker, but they hung back. And I asked them, "You going to come with me?" He said, "No. When you get to that marker, there's a man that's going to come out of that store over there, and he's not going to be happy." But I went ahead. I've been, criticized in print in my public service to my face, so I'm used to that. So I went ahead to the marker, and I started reading it. And sure enough, this guy comes out of this store, makes a beeline across the parking lot to me, and he just raked me over the coals. Why was I reading this? Why was I doing this? And he kept coming back to one point, almost like a refrain. He said, "Why don't we just do happy history?" And as I left that discussion, if you want to say it was pretty much one way. It occurred to me that, this is tough history. And some people simply do not want to study it. But just because it horrifies us doesn't mean we should avoid it. All the more reason we should study it. And after that discussion, I became very fearful that we're having 2 Americas, one that knows this history and one that doesn't. Now, in order to understand lynching, you really have to go back, not to the 1800s, not to the 1700s, but all the way back to the 1600s to understand America today. Now, during that time, the European powers were looking at the Western Hemisphere. How could they make this economically profitable? The Spanish had a huge advantage in South America. They found gold and silver in abundance. The Spanish galleons would take that to Spain and significantly enrich the Spanish throne. But for the English, the Dutch, and the French, they had to look at the Caribbean. How could we make money in the Caribbean? And they found that that area was perfect for the growing of sugar. And sugar was like the petroleum of today. But the way they economically worked was based on slavery. And this is how it worked. When they seized the Africans and transported them across the Atlantic, they came up with a calculation that it was better to work them to death in 3 or 4 years and bring in new Africans than try to set up a system by which they live longer. Such that if you look at the numbers, for the number of Africans that were brought over to the Western Hemisphere, only 6% ended up what is today the United States. The vast majority ended up in the Caribbean and in South America. Now, for the British colonies, as they looked somewhat enviously as their partners to the south, what could they economically develop to help them compete with what they were seeing in the Caribbean and South America? And they did develop a system of slavery. You know, tobacco, indigo was never as profitable. Cotton would come later, never as profitable as what you saw with sugar. But they also ran into a problem. Because in the 1600s, in the mid-1600s, the difference between slave and free was whether you were Christian or non-Christian. And so some of the Christians were actually actively going to those that were slaves, and by the application of water, suddenly giving them their freedom. Now, for those that had economically invested in this, this was a huge danger to their entire system. They had to come up with a new way of defining slavery so they would not have this ability to have freedom. And so Maryland, the colony of Maryland, in the mid-1600s, is the first one to pass a law that said the difference between free and slave, it's not Christian or non-Christian, but whether you're black or whether you're white, knowing full well that a sprinkling of water cannot change the color of your skin. When the other colonies saw what Maryland did, they quickly copied it. They saw the ingenuity of this system. But some people criticized, even at that point, what difference does the color of the skin make? And so a cottage industry develops, and this still has ramifications for America today. Something developed in the 1600s. A cottage industry develops, which supports this, suggesting there is, skin color does matter, mentally, physically, you go down the list, to help support this economic system. So over 2 generations, before Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, "All men are created equal," the white America had been taught that this was the proper way to treat those from Africa. And multiple generations until Lincoln and Douglas had their famous debates throughout Illinois. I really believe if you look at those debates, they provide an incredible insight into America then and also in America today. But oftentimes we look at it kind of cartoonish. I admit Lincoln was a foot taller than Douglas. Douglas was short and rotund. Lincoln's tall and lanky. It naturally makes for a cartoon-type view. But if you start looking at the issues that they debated, that quickly falls away. One of Douglas's most famous speeches during those debates occurred in Bloomington. This is before the debates occurred. Lincoln and Douglas are traveling by train, Chicago, Bloomington, Springfield. And Douglas at Bloomington, he says these words. This is the core of the speech. This will be the core of his campaign. He says, "This nation was founded for white people and for their posterity forever." He then proceeded in the speech to name what he defined as the inferior races. I'm not going to use the words he used: black, Indian, Chinese, Japanese. And even during the debates, he one time said that this should be set up as a nation for white Europeans. But Lincoln realized he really didn't mean that. He actually pressed him on that point. Douglas backed off because he didn't mean all Europeans. And he defined it as Northern Europeans. What was wrong with the Southern Europeans from Douglas's perspective? They were Roman Catholic. Douglas didn't want that. this was for white Protestant. Now, Lincoln in the debates constantly maintained that this was made for all men, not by religion, by skin color, or place of origin. But Douglas won that election. And then he went on to try to run for presidency in 1860. Now, of course, he lost that, and Lincoln won that. When we often talk about the Civil War, we talk about the issue being slavery. But I was challenged by a chief historian, a former chief historian of the Park Service on that. And he was making the case to me, it wasn't as much about slavery, it was white supremacy. It was a fascinating theory he was making, because if it was just about slavery, why did we have all those problems after the Civil War? There must have been something else. And for the Lincoln administration and for America, they got a brief insight what was going to happen after the Civil War down at a place called Fort Pillow in Tennessee. This is just north of Memphis. Confederate forces led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, he would later be the founder and the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, had cornered some Union forces there, half black, half white. When they stormed the fort and they took it, they shot and killed the whites, but especially the black Americans after they had surrendered. It was a precursor of the lynching that would occur after the Civil War. Lincoln was furious, as was his cabinet. And one of the key components of Lincoln's philosophy was the right of law. When they went into that cabinet meeting, they had actually exchanged a memo with all the cabinet members with the idea of taking Confederate prisoners in prisoner of war camp, setting them aside and killing them as retribution because of what happened at Fort Pillow. Now think about Lincoln and how he upheld the rule of law, and his cabinet was willing to consider that. Now when they got in the cabinet meeting, they quickly dispelled that idea and they took no such action. But it gives you an idea of the level of anger that they felt because of what occurred at Fort Pillow. Of course, Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, and then we enter the Reconstruction period. We used to say that Reconstruction failed, this idea of incorporating black Americans into the politics of the country. But a Reconstruction historian, he defined it much differently and I think much better. It wasn't that Reconstruction failed, it was defeated. In 1866, we saw the first indication of what was going to happen. This occurred in Memphis, Tennessee. This is 1 year after the Civil War. There was nothing that infuriated the white powers in the South more than seeing an African American in the uniform of the United States Army. And then Memphis, they came at the end of the month, and they were to be discharged on April 30th, and then May 1st they would be free men, no longer in the Army. And the white forces in Memphis were waiting exactly for this opportunity, because on the next day, the white Memphis police force and others then attacked some of these black veterans. One of them said something that was especially insightful into how America had changed in a year. Before they attacked him, he yelled at them. He said, "Your Abe Lincoln is dead." Because they well knew that Andrew Johnson would support what they were about to do. Over 3 days, they rampaged over Memphis. Over 40 African Americans were killed. Every black church was burned down, and every black school. They well knew the value of education. After 3 days, federal troops eventually started entering the city through a process of martial law and ended that. General Grant, who was still in the Army, was furious at this, what it had done. He told the soldiers to keep track of those who had participated. He sent their names to Andrew Johnson in the White House and said he wanted to arrest these men. Andrew Johnson shared that with his Attorney General. They both said, "There's nothing we can do." And all those who were involved in the Memphis massacre, none of them were charged. And by doing that, Johnson well knew he was giving them a free check to attack African Americans as they so chose. On July 30th, that same year in New Orleans, they attacked African Americans who had assembled together to form a political party. Inside the room where they were firing into that, they said there was blood all over the floor. They clubbed, beat, shot any of the African Americans they found outside. Nobody was prosecuted. And that violence continued until Reconstruction, in fact, failed. Now, as we move through the late 1800s, these lynchings continue. One historian actually estimated that an African American was lynched once every 3 days between the end of the Civil War well into the 20th century. This was incredibly commonplace, which brings us to the beginning of the 20th century. If you look at Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, three presidents right in a row, right at the beginning of the 20th century, I would suggest to you, you would not find three presidents that adored Abraham Lincoln more than these three men. And as Theodore Roosevelt was president, they were heading right to a huge event in American history, 1909, the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. And there began to be talk about having some type of memorial for Lincoln in Washington, D.C. But a year before that, you had one of the most notable lynching events in American history, not by the numbers, but by the impact. And that occurred in Lincoln's hometown in Springfield, Illinois. Now, we don't know exactly how many blacks were killed in this. We know of two definitely that were lynched. But there are two aspects of that. I don't want to go into great detail on that event, but there are two aspects that's critical that we remember, especially those that are part of the Springfield community. Number one, it was a regional impact. I've been looking through newspapers, and one article especially struck me. As the African Americans were fleeing Springfield on the trains or walking, at St. Louis, as one reporter noted, a train pulled up from Springfield. The black Americans flooded, men, women, children, and they were bleeding. How wounded must they have been in Springfield to take a train trip to St. Louis, and they're still bleeding when they're getting off the train? But that was where they had family, friends, they were going there. We have one newspaper suggested they even went as far as New Orleans to escape Springfield, but this becomes a regional event, going to Bloomington, Chicago, trying to escape Springfield. The second aspect is what comes out of it, and this is the most important part of the Springfield race riot, the foundation of the NAACP. If you start looking at lynching events that occur after this, the NAACP plays a critical role in documenting these events, not only for the Americans of that time, but especially for us, for those Americans yet to come. And I'll highlight one incredibly significant situation where they documented a lynching event that we would not have known nearly as well as we do now had it not been for a field secretary from the NAACP. And then comes 1909, the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, and the movement to have a memorial in Washington, D.C. really takes up speed at that point. A commission is founded. William Howard Taft, who is then president, is honored to be the head of this commission, and they break ground in 1914. And then in 1950, while they're starting construction of the Lincoln Memorial, one of the most famous films in American history is released. It's called Birth of a Nation. If you haven't seen this film, I'd encourage you to watch it for educational purposes, certainly not for entertainment purposes. I've seen it once. I saw it with a mixed audience. The word uncomfortable doesn't come even close to describing how I felt watching that film. It was based on a book called The Klansman, and Thomas Dixon Jr., incredibly popular book. It was so popular they decided to make a movie because they thought they could make money. D.W. Griffith was responsible to this film, and Griffith would claim to be a huge Lincoln supporter. He actually did a film on Lincoln after this. But the caricatures of black Americans in this film are just horrific. I'm not even going to describe them, they're just horrific. But every time he showed Lincoln in the film, Griffith made sure it was perfect because he truly believed he was following Lincoln's footsteps when he did this film. It made more money than all the films before that had been done in America. In Los Angeles, 3,000 white people paid money to watch this film, and it also made history for the White House. Wilson was thrilled to show it in the White House. It is the first film showed in that building and gave it an incredible amount of publicity, and of course it was something that Wilson was very supportive of. In 1916, they had finished the foundation of the Lincoln Memorial, and they started the colonnades, the 36 colonnades representing the 36 states of the Union, and then that brings us to 1917. I want to highlight a lynching that occurred in Chicago, not because the numbers were particularly high, but it showed that even this type of philosophy could be extended even there. So you're at a beach. It was informally segregated. One side was black, one side was white. A group of black teenagers had built a raft. It somehow had drifted into the white part. And so white people started stoning them, throwing them at the raft. One black teenager was hit and he drowned. And the south side of Chicago erupted. 1,000 to 2,000 black families lost their home in the rioting that occurred after that. And again, it signifies that it permeates everywhere. There was another lynching in Omaha. I won't go into it. I don't have time now. But these do occur in the north as well. But I want to highlight one that occurred in 1917, perhaps the most significant in terms of publicity, in Memphis, Tennessee, lynching in 1917. There's a 15-year-old girl. Her name's Antoinette Rappel. She bicycles from home to school every day. One day she doesn't come home. And so there's a frantic search to try to find her. They find her bicycle upright near a bridge. And that's very significant in terms of what comes later. They go into the woods. They find her dead body. She had been decapitated. There were also tire tracks, and there was a very expensive white coat left at the crime scene. Now, all that evidence would lead you, and the fact that the bike was upright, she probably knew her attacker. So the investigation should have begun with family members, friends. Instead, they instantly assumed it must have been a black man. And there was a young man named L. Persons. He'd been married for just less than a year. They had a child, we don't know the gender, less than a year old. But he just happened to be living near this site. So they arrested him, they took him into the police station. It was perfectly acceptable at that point to use beatings and electrocution to try to get a confession, which they claimed they did. They took him out of Memphis for his own safety, but then brought him back for some reason. Somehow people knew what train he was on. The train stopped. The white mob got on the train and pulled him off. And then afterwards, they announced in the Memphis newspapers, boldly announced, that he's going to be lynched at this place at this time, close to where they found Rappel's body. Kids were let out of school. 3,000 to 5,000 white people in a festive atmosphere showed up for this lynching. They tied him to a log, they poured gasoline on him, and they lit him on fire. And as was often common practice for lynchings in America at that time, after the fire was down, they would actually cut pieces of the body off for souvenirs. They decapitated the body, took the head to Beale Street, Memphis, which is the center of the black business district, and threw it in the middle of the street. James Weldon Johnson, he's a field secretary for the NAACP, does extraordinary work at that time and for American history and for us today. He goes to investigate the lynching and provides an incredibly comprehensive report, of course concluding that L. Persons had nothing to do with the murder. But what was especially interesting is these words that came to him when he was down there in Memphis. He includes it in his autobiography. I think it's some of the best words he ever came up in his incredibly literate life. He's standing there where L. Persons had been lynched. And this thought occurs to him. The struggle for him today, I would suggest, moving on to the present, from Weldon's perspective, is the fight for the black America's body and white America's soul. Back in Washington in 1918, they had finished the colonnades and were starting to work on the roof. And then that brings us to 1919. And this is often called the Red Summer because of the extraordinary number of lynchings that occur. And I'll just highlight one of the most notable that occurs in northeast Arkansas. It's called the Elaine Massacre. Some of the numbers have over 200 black Americans that were killed in this event. It occurs in Phillips County there. To understand it, what was going on there, you had black Americans working in the cotton fields under incredibly oppressive conditions, and they think that it's time for them to form a union. And when you consider what happens next, it's like you piled a pile of dry wood and someone just flicks a match on it. So they meet in a church to decide how to proceed to develop a union. And some of the white people hear about it, and some of them approach. We don't know who fired what shot first, but shots were fired. One white man was killed, and then word spread that all the black Americans in Phillips County were revolting. White mobs of Mississippi, Tennessee, and parts of Arkansas all come to Phillips County. But the most significant part is that the governor of Arkansas contacts the White House. Remember, Woodrow Wilson is president. And he asks for U.S. Army soldiers to help out. And the Wilson White House approves. By train, they come into Phillips County. These are veterans of World War I. They've learned how to fight armed Germans in France. They're going to take that skill and those weapons, and they're going to use it against the black Americans in Phillips County. One historian that wrote this talks about two areas he called the killing fields. In one case, the U.S. Army troops formed a line, and they moved ahead across this field. Now, the black Americans, they were hiding, they were running away, they were trying to do anything they could to survive. As one eyewitness heard, as these soldiers crossed this field, they could hear the rat-tat-tat of the machine gun as they killed every black American they found. Then, they caused black families, men, women, and children to hide in these cane brakes, and they stepped back, aligned their machine guns, and unleashed their fire on them. Only one black American escaped from that. Nobody was prosecuted. The governor of Arkansas was so thrilled at how this turned out, he actually kept a scrapbook for the rest of his life, which he would show to people in his participation and how well this had been conducted. The Wilson administration took absolutely no action whatsoever. Back in Washington, they had finished the colonnades on the Lincoln Memorial and finished the roof. Basically, as you see the Lincoln Memorial today, was completed in 1919. At the end of December, they put the lower half of Lincoln's statue. By January 1920, they finished the upper half, and that part was complete. For the next 2 years, they proceeded to do the landscaping and the roads, and then came to the dedication ceremony in 1922. They only invited one African American, and this was done by William Howard Taft, who again had been president, had led this commission, was incredibly proud to be associated with Lincoln in this way. The person they selected was Dr. Martin. He's from the second president of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. But as Taft started thinking about this, he didn't trust him. So he asked Moton to send his script to him ahead of time. And he looked through it, and sure enough, Moton was talking about the unfinished work that lay before us. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that's what the position Taft had at that time, then took out all those comments. He told Moton, I don't want to hear anything about this. This is about unity. So when he stood up to give his speech, it was remarks edited by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and when he looked out of the crowd, it had been segregated. All the black Americans had been shoved to one side. I also want to point out another person that was there. Wilson desperately wanted to go there. He was in D.C., but he was in poor health, and he could only listen to it on the radio. But Lincoln's only living son was there, Robert Todd Lincoln. Again, Willie, Ted, and Eddie had all died before the age of 17. But Robert Todd Lincoln had been head of the Pullman Car Company for a while, and had significantly increased his personal wealth. But you have to understand, what was the Pullman Car Company selling that significantly enriched the wealth of Lincoln's only remaining son? And we often talk about the Pullman railroad cars, how fancy they were. This was first class. But if you look at the newspapers, that's not what they're advertising. They show the photograph of a smiling black Pullman porter. That's what they were advertising. All the porters were black, all the passengers were white. Several times blacks tried to get on the Pullman cars and they were denied entry. They didn't even have a name tag. They were called George, after George Pullman, who started the company. They were beaten, pushed around. An American historian, a black American historian, came up with this wonderful phrase. It was plantation nostalgia. And it was successful both in the South and in the North, and that's how Robert Todd Lincoln accumulated his wealth. Now, if we think the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial caused some great change in the country, it was just a few years later, over 30,000 Americans marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, from the Capitol to the White House, and they were dressed in the attire of the Ku Klux Klan, waving American flags, again, just a few years after the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. I really believe that the fight starts beginning in the 1930s, and I really believe this is black agency. It's the African Americans that start rising up and reclaiming Lincoln as he should have been. And the first most significant event of that was Marian Anderson in 1939. She was denied as a black American the right to sing at the Daughters of the American Revolution. Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, the Secretary of Interior arranged to have her sing at the Lincoln Memorial. The video's online, you can watch it. And she sang, "My country, 'tis of thee." And the real event that started to change the Lincoln Memorial permanently was King's speech in 1963. He's talked about the unfinished work that lay before us, exactly what Moton wanted to speak about and before the dedication, was denied doing that. But I would suggest to you the Lincoln Memorial was not completed in the 20th century. And I want to share with you a story that occurred to me while I was working there one day. I saw a young father and his son. He's maybe 8, 9 years old. And as he was standing, the father kept doing this type of motion towards one of the steps. And I just didn't know what he was trying to convey to his son. But then it occurred to me, the father had done his research. The step he was pointing to was where King gave his speech. It was unmarked. But he wanted his son to know the significance of that spot, because he never knew whether the two of them would visit this again. And so I would suggest the Lincoln Memorial wasn't finished until 2003, because in that year, they actually put a plaque, which you can see today, that marks the spot where King spoke. The memorial remained unfinished until that plaque was there, pointing to the unfinished work that lay before us. Thank you.
Okay. It's really, really tough to talk about this, but we're going to bring up a very distinguished panel to do just that. And so if you'd like to come on up, I'm going to briefly describe you so that we have time to listen to you. We're going to invite this panel, first, very distinguished. First is Catherine Harris. She's the 2020 SJR First Citizen, dubbed the First Lady of History by the Illinois State Historical Society. She is the past president of the President Abraham Lincoln Association. She is the first woman and the first black person to hold the office since its founding in 1909. She is a past board member and emeritus of the SPI in Central Illinois African American History Museum, and she's a graduate and a proud Saluki of SIU.
Saluki dogs.
Next, we have Austin Randolph. He is the president of the Springfield branch of the NAACP, which was founded here, as you just heard, after the 1908 race riots in Springfield. He is past president of Frontier International, focusing on youth, mentoring, and public service. He is a 30-year veteran of the Illinois Department of Corrections, retiring as the Deputy Director of Operations for the Northern Region. He is a graduate of Greenville College, has done so many other things, most recently attending the signing of the proclamation of the 1908 race riot monument by President Biden at the White House. Welcome. And last but not least is Erica Austin. She is a Springfield native. She is the Executive Director of External Relations for SIU School of Medicine. Erica has her associate degree in social science from Lincoln College, her bachelor's in sociology from Drake University, her master's in human services from UIS. She is a PhD candidate at ISU in their higher education administration program, and she's currently vice president of the District 186 School Board. So all three have much longer resumes and many awards, but we'll start with that. I have a few questions, which I left over here. Okay, the first question is, what does this history that you've just heard to the African American community living in Springfield mean, and how do you think knowing this story might change the lives and attitudes of our residents, both black and white, today? Take it away.
You have the microphone.
Good morning. That is a very interesting question. And let me just give you a little footnote. It's unfinished work.
Amen.
With the help of God, we must come together. We have suffered. We have been through trauma, hatred, love, discrimination. I can go on. History is repeating itself, and we must do something about it. We must educate all communities. We need to solve the problem. We need to come together. That is why the NAACP was started. And we cannot forget not only our history, but the significant event of 1908. That's why we have the proclamation and the designated site to keep it in our minds, teach our children, and to move forward so that it never happen again.
I'd like to say that you might remember that W.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And we still have not yet dealt with that. I have a book at home that's called Why is Everything About Race? Because everything is about race. Because it permeates our society. It is within every action, unstated or not. We, as black people, deal with microaggressions from white folks that you don't even know that you're doing, because it is a part of you. And unless somebody pulls your chain and calls it to your attention, you don't know about it. But you should just think about it. I recall standing at the desk when I was at the library with one of my staff members who was white. The visitor came in, asked a question, looked at my staff member. My staff member turned to me and said, "Now, where do you think I should start?" And you should have seen the reaction of the visitor. Just think about it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I believe the information that we just heard could help in various ways, and I'm going to speak from a youth perspective. Our young people need to hear about these things, but not only that, how it applies to their everyday life. So I was very instrumental in a program called the History Makers and the Freedom Riders that Tim Townsend was a part of. He was over. And I remember I took a couple of kids to Chicago, to the Dutton Museum in Chicago. And, you know, you could tell kids all day about something, but they have to see it for themselves. And I remember I had like this troubled kid, and, you know, when he stopped at this particular exhibit, he looked at me, he said, "Miss Erica, did you know?" And the exhibit was Emmett Till, right? 15 years old, just like him. And he was like, "Did you know?" I was like, "Yeah, I've been trying to tell you this whole time." But for him to see it for himself, to see that picture, to see what they did to him, I saw a light bulb go off. And now this young man is 24 years old. He's on the right path. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He has excelled in everything, but it took that. It took them to see this could happen to me at 15 years old. He's my age. So I think when you're dealing with young people, you have to make it prevalent to them. You have to let them see, and you have to encourage them. And you know, and I hate to say this, but we have to teach them a different way. Like I tell them all the time, you can't just go out there and just do that. You are a black young man in America. We have to hold ourselves to a different level. You have to dress a certain way. And so when he saw that, he started doing everything that we had been telling him to do. So I think you have to apply it to real life experiences for them to understand that, yeah, you may not see lynching with the noose hanging in the past, but lynching is still very prevalent today.
Okay, next question. How did the Biden administration's designation for a national park of the 1908 race riots in Springfield come about? And is there a fallback plan for moving forward if the federal government reneges on their promise to fund this project and monument? We'll start with you, Mr. Randolph.
Because that's all about you. And we thank you for it being all about you.
Good morning again. We know what the history is. Our plan is to build the monument. We will raise the funds necessary to get the job done. And let me thank you. With the help of God, and more importantly, with the help of each and every one of you in this room, let me first thank the community, the elected officials, the organizations, businesses, companies. That is why we have the proclamation, the designation, the signing. We must build this monument for those who have went on to a better life with God, but more importantly, for the future of our children. This tragedy, this riot, this mob, we must stop this type of hatred. We are supposed to be a country for all. And the NAACP works toward that. That is why that monument will get built. That is why I am asking each and every one of you to contribute, to help. And we will put a plan together to make sure it gets done. With funding or without funding, God will find a way. And I believe each and every one of you will want to see that happen and never let that tragedy happen again.
Let me just say here that Mr. Randolph was invited to the Biden White House for the signing of the proclamation, which he has the original copy here today. And he also has pictures with him of the bill signing. So be sure to take a look at those before you leave. Go ahead, Catherine.
I don't know why you gave me this again.
Because you have something to say.
I've almost forgotten what the question is. Go ahead.
Go ahead and we'll go on to the next question then. The next question is, do we need to be doing more to tell the story in our schools today? And if so, what do you suggest?
Without a doubt, we need to tell this story. I have asked, and I'm sure Erica can definitely answer this question. I have a friend who, she's now retired, and she taught about the race riot in her class. I asked her if the other, I think it was maybe the 5th grade, somewhere along in there, that she was teaching it. I asked her about her high school colleagues, were they teaching it? And she said, well, the black teachers do. The white teachers did not. And for something as significant as this event was to have happened in our own hometown and it not be taught in our schools is not a good thing, because people need to know. I was amazed when I came to Springfield that I had not learned about it at school. I worked at the public library, and there was a little folder, and it was about the 1908 race riot. When my daughter was at Lincoln Land, she wrote a paper for her history class, and she wrote about the race riot, and her teacher did not know. That is unconscionable that he did not know. And her teacher asked him, well, where did you find this information? She said, well, my mom's a librarian and she knows how to find stuff. But we do need to teach about that, not only for historical purposes, but just so, as we've said, we don't need to let it happen again.
Absolutely. This should be taught in the schools, and no matter how painful it may be, talk about it, it's still our history. You can't erase it. It did happen. And so it amazes me how when I go to the schools, even as a board member, and I remember I was moderating the trivia for one of the schools, and I asked the question, where was the 1908 race riots held? I think the answers was Detroit, Chicago, California. Nobody ever said Springfield, Illinois, ever. And so when I said Springfield, Illinois, they were like, are you serious, Miss Austin? I said, yes, I'm dead serious. Like, this happened here in Springfield. And we're not teaching our own history. And I would, begin to give landmarks. Do you know where St. John's Hospital is at? Yeah? That's where most of the blacks lived. And where they came, where they did the lynchings. St. John's Hospital, Springfield? Yeah. So I began to give landmarks, they began to connect, but they never knew because nobody's teaching them this information. And it's because we want to hide it. I think I didn't find out about this race riot until I was in college. And that's because a student, I believe, uncovered this for a project at her school and said, hey, I think it was like a history project or something that she did. And she uncovered this. And that's when I was like, whoa, I've been in Springfield all my life and didn't know myself. And we're still not teaching it. We have to get away from being ashamed of what happened and start teaching our kids their history of their own hometown. I think if we begin to do that, they will begin to, their behaviors will change, their actions will change. If they begin to see, I know I took some kids on the walking tour of the NAACP, the markers. Right. And I mean, I'm just saying, like, you talk to these kids, the light bulbs will truly start going off, but they have to know. And like she said, the black teachers, they're teaching it, but the white teachers are not. And white teachers have to not to be scared to teach this information as well. We have to get trainings, maybe that the MSCP can do that, trainings on how to teach them about the information that is happening, or that has happened in Springfield, Illinois. I just think that if we know better, we do better. All right? Like I said, and no matter how painful it is, it happened. And we have to tell our stories so that history does not repeat itself in that manner.
Erica, can you please tell us why you have those names on your shirt? What's the significance of that?
So, this is from the Root History Museum. William Donegan, we know that he was lynched. He was a shoemaker.
Here in Springfield, right?
Here in Springfield. These are all Springfield.
He made shoes for Mr. Lincoln.
Mr. Lincoln. Scott Burton was also lynched. He was a barber. And we have Jameson Jenkins. I don't believe he was lynched, but he was a neighbor of Mr. Lincoln. And this shirt can be purchased at Root History, but I wanted to wear this today as symbolic of the lynchings that did occur in Springfield, Illinois. And the first two were actually lynched. Mr. William Donegan did not have anything to do with what had happened, but because he was married to a white woman, they went to his house, cut his throat, and hung him from a tree. So, history.
Difficult as it is, we need to know it.
The interesting thing about Donegan's lynching, that occurred right next to the new state capitol. Mm-hmm. And most of the rioting occurred in this area. They made a point of going all the way over there to target him for whatever reason. Right.
And just one other piece to add to that. Take the time to go to St. John's Hospital. There is a mural that was helped develop by Preston Jackson, one of our own black sculptors in this area. Take a look at it. It talks about the history of not only the black community, but the other events that took place during that time in 1908. And that is very important because St. John Hospital was one of the hospitals and businesses that really helped the black community survive. There were many other white businesses and other individuals in the community that knew what was happening was wrong. And that is important because we want to tell the whole story, that there were good people trying to save other people. But let's educate our youth so we will never forget.
I'd suggest we could maybe take this video, today's 1-hour presentation, and show it at all of our schools. That would be a good way to start.
I also want to follow up on Austin's point. When we talk about telling a story, we're especially interested in historic preservation. What still remains of that story? In addition to these 3 incredible people, we're also blessed with 3 buildings that can also tell that story. 3 buildings that actually were eyewitnesses to these events. When I talked about the refugee crisis, they were leaving from the railroad stations. What we termed the Lincoln Depot was the Wabash. What the state owns was Illinois Central, ran trains to Chicago. And the events that I told you about come from those that boarded trains, what is now the Amtrak station. It was a Chicago and Alton. And as you well know, with the 3rd Street removal of the railroad tracks, Amtrak's going to be vacating that building in a few years. And the community of Springfield will have a decision to make. What should happen to that building? I want you to imagine giving a talk about the race riot inside that building with the same walls that were there in 1908 and talking about the fear of those coming into the station, trying to get out of Springfield, bleeding, having been beaten, men, women, children. What an opportunity that would be to tell that story in that building.
It would really be if these walls could talk.
Norm Sims, would you come up and grab a microphone? We're going to do some Q&A real quick. So if you have a question, please stand up, state your name and state your question, and don't give us a speech. Yeah, right here.
Not giving a speech.
I almost lost it.
Thank you.
I'm going to try not to get in the way of the camera. I've learned my lesson.
Hi, I'm Ann Mosley. I'm with the Sangamon Experience at the University of Illinois Springfield. Thank you so much for being here and telling this story. I grew up in Springfield, graduated from Glenwood in Chatham. I'm sitting down because of the camera. The reason why I have a question for you is because I come from a family of historians, and I never heard about the race riots growing up here. I became good friends with Catherine and interviewed her for a class at SIU Edwardsville, and got to know her better and asked her what I like to call the white questions, because a lot of times it's difficult to know what's right to say, what's not right to say. And as I got my job here, I'm sorry I'm giving a little spiel.
Yeah, you are.
One of my first exhibits was called Struggle for Change, and I was going through city records and came across a date from 1987 called The Desegregation of Local Government here in Springfield, Illinois. Can I see a show of hands of how many people knew about that one? You covered it? I knew nothing about it. Called Catherine, asked her about it, and she asked where I was, and I said, that was the year I was born. So my question to the panel is, we talk about the 1908 race riot. Are there plans to tell the black story here in Springfield that took place between 1908 and 87 and beyond?
That's an interesting question. Because you could talk about redlining, which still exists. You could talk...
Catherine, use a microphone.
Oh, I was saying you could talk about redlining in such an event, which was very prevalent. And we have a map from like the late 1930s, and that's at the African American History Museum. And I've seen folks come in and look at it and see where, if their address was in the redlining area. And I could do some more about redlining, but I'm going to stop. But that's one topic that could be included. We could talk about when was the first African-American teacher hired to teach in Springfield Public Schools. We could talk about that. Why did it take so long? So there could be lots of other things that I can't remember right now off the top of my head. So Erica, maybe you or Austin or Tim can.
Well, I'd like to know more about it, but history repeats itself. This is not new. There are many incidents, situation, desegregation, employment. We could go on and on about the schools, about employment, about politics, city government. There are many issues that we have to go through. There's a consent decree that's still in place with the school district that they're supposed to meet certain criteria for minorities, for hiring black teachers and administrators. We have to look at the whole picture. Remember, all of this is in, as you say, in the library, a place where the depository of all of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we must take the time to make it public. The National Park Service has plenty of information about what has happened not only here in Illinois, but across the country. And there are many other organizations that are telling the story, the struggle, the hurt and pain and suffering of the building of this country. And that's important because history repeats itself, and we all know what's going on today. You don't want to take something down. We can talk about monuments, we can talk about famous Americans. We know the story. We know part of the story. The issue is, how do you teach it? When do you educate the public? And when do you stop doing what's wrong? That's the key. We have to educate each other.
And I'm going to gently chide any historians, authors, or writers in the audience today, because you know how many books there are on the Springfield race riot? There's one. Decades old. Now, why hasn't there been another? When, for the Memphis Massacre, the person that wrote the first book on it did it right before the 150th anniversary. Why had no one done anything? And in fact, he admitted, I saw him in a talk, he said, when people said he should write on this, he said, well, I know why no one's written on it, there's no information. Well, when he dug into it, he found there wasn't one, not two, but 3 federal investigations of the Memphis Massacre in 1866. He went from thinking there was none to too much for a book. But again, the question, why did it take 150 years for that? Why is there only one on the Springfield race riot?
We have time for one more question.
But behind the camera, right here, this lady, your name and a quick question.
Judy Wagenblast. I'm a community volunteer with several organizations. And I will stand.
Stand here, Judy. You're fine.
All right, thank you. Okay. Just a question for any of you. Any comments that you have about the role of journalism in telling this story, and particularly Ida B. Wells?
Well, Joyce only gave me, 30 minutes, Joyce, to talk, so I didn't get a chance. Ida B. Wells is huge, just huge. She's out there investigating. She went down to Elaine. She was down there. She's the one that wrote the most comprehensive report on it. What we know about it is primarily from her. And she was risking her life going into these areas, and sometimes she had to flee because they figured out who she was and what she was doing. They didn't want it to be reported. So journalism plays a huge role. Everything I told you about what happened in St. Louis with the black Americans pulling off those railroad cars, I got that from a newspaper article. So journalism is unquestionably the foundation on which we can build for this.
We have 30 seconds. If you want to close that out.
Close it out.
keep doing what you're doing. Ida B. Wells was a very well-known lady, and there's a housing development named after her in Chicago. She, among other people, too many to mention. Never forget the history. Always continue to build on the history. I tell and I ask, that is a teacher's responsibility, to teach, to research, and to pass the word on. Teach our children, not only in the school, but also teach in the churches, teach in the home, teach in the streets. We must come together, we must work together.
We're going to keep teaching here. And speaking of what you had mentioned earlier, the city government, we hope that you will all join us for our next program. It's April 25th. It's at 8 a.m. It's either going to be here or across the hall. And we have invited Mayor Misty Buscher and her chief budget director to come talk about the budget and how our tax dollars are at work for us in Springfield. So think of your questions. Come join us and learn about what the city's doing with your tax dollars. And with that, I have one quick announcement. These flyers are out there somewhere, and there's going to be a symposium and workshop on Journeys to Justice at the Wyndham Center, April 4th and 5th. So pick one of these up if you're interested in learning even more than the panel has had time to tell you today. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, everyone.